The wind had a way of scraping across the plains like a dull blade, steady, unrelenting, and cold as the edge of truth. It carried with it the dust of forgotten cattle drives and the faint, ghostly echoes of men who had long since vanished into the horizon. Eli Boone stood alone by the split-rail fence, one hand braced against the rough wood, his hat drawn low over eyes that had forgotten the warmth of mercy. The fields beyond lay barren, their soil cracked and thirsty, mirroring the emptiness that had taken root inside him. The winter sun hung low, pale and distant, as though it too wanted no part in this land. A letter sat folded in his coat pocket, creased, sweat-stained, and worn from too much handling. It bore the seal of the county clerk, a simple note of transaction, the purchase of a bride for $1, a sum so small it felt like a sin. But he had no illusions about romance or redemption. What he needed was someone to share the silence, to tend the hearth when the nights turned cruel, and to keep the ghosts at bay. She arrived the next morning, carried in the back of a freight wagon alongside sacks of flour and crates of nails. Her name was Clara, though she spoke it soft, like it was a thing she had borrowed and might soon return. Her dress was plain, her hands red and raw from travel, her eyes steady in the way of someone who had already lost much. Eli offered her water and a nod. Words felt heavy, unnecessary. They stood in the wind a long while, strangers bound by paper and desperation. The house waited, a modest cabin with a leaning chimney and a porch that creaked like old bones. Inside, the air smelled of pine smoke and loneliness. She took it in without complaint, moving through each room as though memorizing the shape of her new world. Eli watched her, uneasy, caught between gratitude and shame. $1. It seemed a cruel measure for a soul. That first night, the silence lay thick between them. The fire snapped and hissed, shadows crawling along the walls like restless spirits. Clara sat near the hearth, mending a tear in her skirt with careful stitches, her face lit by the amber glow. Eli busied himself with the tools by the door, though his hands shook from the weight of what he'd done. He thought of his mother's Bible, still wrapped in cloth beneath the floorboards, and the verses she'd whispered of love and covenant. This arrangement was neither. It was survival, stripped of poetry. In the weeks that followed, life unfolded in small, unspoken rhythms. At dawn, Eli would ride out to check the fence lines, the frost biting at his beard. Clara would sweep the porch, gather water, knead bread, with the quiet precision of someone trying to earn her place. They spoke little, but in the silence there was something honest and understanding that words could not soften the edges of hardship. Yet there were moments when the world shifted. One evening, as the sun bled out across the sky, Clara stood by the window, humming a tune so faint it might have been mistaken for the wind. Eli paused in the doorway, caught by the sound. It stirred something buried deep, a memory of his sister singing to the lambs, before fever took her and left the house hollow. For the first time in months, his chest ached with something other than sorrow. Still, the nights were long. Clara would lie awake, listening to the coyotes call from the ridge, their cries like mourning. She wondered about the road that had brought her here, about the towns she'd passed through where laughter still lived. The man beside her breathed slow and heavy, his dreams tangled with regret. She could feel the distance between them, a canyon carved by years of solitude and loss. One morning, as she carried a pail from the well, she caught sight of Eli kneeling in the dirt by the barn. His hands were buried in the earth, his shoulders trembling not from labor but from the quiet storm inside him. She said nothing, only set the pail down and stepped closer. When he looked up, his eyes were raw, stripped of pride, and in that moment, something shifted. She reached out not with words, but with the soft press of her hand against his. He did not pull away. The prairie stretched endless around them, vast and indifferent. But beneath that sky, a seed had been planted, small, uncertain, yet alive. It would take more than time to grow. It would take trust, patience, and the courage to believe that love could be forged not from promise, but from endurance. The thaw came slow that year, the earth reluctant to yield its frostbitten grip. Each morning Clara stepped out into the pale light, her breath a thin cloud drifting toward the gray horizon. The land was waking cautious, like a wounded thing. Streams began to murmur again, and the air held the faint scent of damp soil and juniper. She felt it stirring something inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The quiet hope of beginning again. Eli worked the fields with grim devotion, turning the soil with hands hardened by loss and labor. He seldom spoke, but Clara had begun to read his silence, the weight of it, the small cracks where kindness showed through. When he left a tin cup of warm coffee by the porch each dawn before heading out, she recognized it as care. When he mended the hinge on the kitchen door without being asked, she saw it for what it was, a wordless apology for the distance between them. At night, they sat across from one another at the rough-hewn table, eating in the soft glow of lamplight. Sometimes the wind howled so fiercely it rattled the window panes, and she would glance toward him, her eyes questioning if the house would hold. He'd nod once, steady and sure. It wasn't comfort spoken aloud, but it was enough. One evening, as the fire burned low, Clara began to speak not of her past, not yet, but of the small things that gave shape to her days. The sound of meadowlarks beyond the barn, the way the horizon blushed just before dawn. Eli listened, his head bowed, as though her words were a hymn he hadn't known he needed. When she paused, he told her of his father's land, how it once stretched far beyond what they could now see, before the drought, before the debts, how his mother's hands smelled of sage and soap, how her voice lingered in the rafters even after she was gone. There was no mention of the transaction that had bound them. That word dollar hung silent between them, an old scar they both carried but no longer touched. Instead, they built something out of gestures, shared bread, mended fences, the passing of a coat on cold mornings. Slowly, the house began to feel less like a tomb and more like a place where life might take root. Spring deepened. Clara learned the rhythm of the land, the stubbornness of the soil, the patience of planting. She rode beside Eli in the wagon, her hands blistered from the plow handles, her cheeks reddened by wind. He showed her how to read the sky for storms, how to listen for the hum of distant rain. She learned quickly, and he found himself watching her with a quiet admiration he did not know how to name. One afternoon, as they repaired a broken section of fence, Clara paused, her gaze fixed on the far hills. "I thought the world would feel smaller here," she murmured, her voice barely rising above the wind. "But it doesn't. It feels endless." Eli glanced at her, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Endless can be a blessing," he said, "or a burden." She nodded, understanding more than she could say. For both of them, the horizon held ghosts of what had been lost and what might yet be found. That night, as rain tapped gently against the roof, Clara woke to find Eli sitting by the fire, his Bible open in his lap. The pages were worn, the ink faded. He did not see her watching, but she saw the way his lips moved, forming silent prayers. Something in her chest ached then, a tenderness born not of pity, but of recognition. They were both survivors of a kind, stitched together by circumstance and longing. Weeks passed, and the fields began to green. Birds returned, and wildflowers threaded color through the grass. Clara sang while she worked, her voice weaving through the stillness. Eli found himself pausing to listen, his hands resting on the worn handle of his spade. It was a sound that made the world feel less empty. But even as life stirred, shadows lingered. One day, a rider came up the road, a man from the settlement, hat low, eyes sharp. He brought news and curiosity. Whispers of the $1 bride had traveled farther than Eli cared to know. The man's smirk cut deeper than any blade. After he left, Clara sat on the porch steps, her hands folded in her lap. "Do they all know?" she asked quietly. Eli stood beside her, jaw clenched, shame burning hot beneath his skin. "Let them talk," he said, though his voice was rough with regret. "They don't know you. They don't know what you're worth." She looked up at him, tears bright in her eyes. "Do you?" The question hung between them, fragile as glass. He knelt then, rough hands trembling as they reached for hers. "I thought I did," he whispered, "but every day I see more than I deserve." And for the first time, Clara believed him. Summer came fierce and unrelenting, the sun a white hammer over the plains. Days bled into one another, long shimmering hours filled with sweat, dust, and silence, broken only by the hum of cicadas and the creak of wood beneath heat. The fields they had sown together now shimmered with promise, stalks rising where once only bare earth stretched. It was labor that carved itself into their bones, but it bound them. Too, each shared burden a quiet vow spoken without words. Clara's hands grew strong, her skin browned by the Sunday. She rose before dawn, gathering eggs, sweeping the porch, tending to the small garden by the well. Sometimes Eli would catch her pausing there, eyes closed, face turned toward the first blush of morning. In those still moments, she seemed to belong wholly to the land, rooted, steady, unafraid. He'd stand in the doorway, watching, a strange ache in his chest, something like gratitude, something like love. Their days settled into a rhythm as steady as the turning of the earth. They spoke more now, not in grand confessions, but in small, steady offerings, the way a bird nested in the rafters, the sound of thunder rolling far off, the taste of cool water after hours in the Sunday. Eli began to laugh again, quietly at first, then with a warmth that startled him. Clara's laughter followed, soft and bright, weaving through the house like music. It startled the silence into life. One evening, as dusk gathered over the hills, they sat on the porch steps, shoulders almost touching. Fireflies rose from the tall grass, flickering like tiny lanterns. Clara broke the silence first. "Back east," she said, voice low, "I used to think love came like a storm loud, sweeping everything away. I waited for it, believed in it." She paused, fingers tracing the grain of the wood beneath her. "But maybe it's not like that. Maybe it's a seed, something you tend, little by little." Eli's eyes lingered on her profile, the soft curve of her cheek, the quiet strength in her voice. "Storms come fast," he said, "but they don't stay." She turned to him then, meeting his gaze. In her eyes he saw not pity, not fear, but understanding, a reflection of the same longing that lived in him. And though no words were spoken, something passed between them, a fragile truth blooming in the fading light. That night, the wind rose, carrying with it the scent of rain. They worked together to gather tools, to bar the shutters. Thunder rolled close as they hurried through the yard, and when the first drops began to fall, Clara reached for his hand without thinking. Eli's fingers closed around hers, rough and sure. For a heartbeat, the storm paused around them, and the world held still. The rain came heavy, drumming on the roof, filling the barrels by the eaves. Inside, they sat before the fire, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. Eli reached for the old Bible, setting it on the table between them. "My mother used to read from it every night," he said. "Said it was the only thing that could keep a man honest." He opened it to a page worn thin by years of touch. "I've been thinking maybe she was right." Clara leaned closer, eyes tracing the faded ink. "And what do you believe?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his voice steady but low. "That maybe I've been given a second chance, and I don't aim to waste it." The storm raged outside, but inside, the world grew still. They sat side by side, the fire casting their shadows long and golden against the walls. Clara rested her hand on the table, and Eli placed his over it. No demand, no promise, only the quiet weight of understanding. Days passed, and the world ripened. The wheat bent heavy with grain, the air thick with the hum of life. Yet beneath the rhythm of their labor, something unspoken stirred. Eli's debt to the trader in town hung over him like a gathering cloud. He had not told Clara of it, the borrowed coin for seed, the note that would soon come due. Pride held his tongue, but worry carved itself into his brow. One afternoon, she found him by the barn, the letter clutched in his hand. "It's nothing," he said, too quickly. But she had learned the shape of his silence, and she knew better. "Tell me," she urged. He hesitated, then handed her the folded page. As she read, her breath caught. The sum was small, but the threat behind it was not. The trader's name was a cruel one, Harlan Finch, a man who took more than coin when debts went unpaid. Clara lifted her gaze, steady and clear. "We'll face it," she said, "together." Eli's throat tightened. He had carried burdens alone for so long. He had forgotten what it meant to be seen, to be trusted. "You shouldn't have to," he whispered. Her answer was simple, certain. We share the land. We share the work. We share the fight. And for the first time, Eli believed they might weather more than just the storms of the sky. The harvest came early, golden and full, as though the land itself had chosen to bless their struggle. Each dawn, Clara and Eli worked side by side beneath a sky burnished with fire, their bodies moving in rhythm, cutting, binding, stacking. Sweat streaked their faces, their hands raw and blistered, but there was pride in their labor, a quiet joy in what they had built together. The fields, once barren, now shimmered with promise, and for a while the weight of the coming reckoning eased. But the world beyond their fence did not rest. Harlan Finch arrived one afternoon in a wagon lined with polished wood and rusted iron. His smile was thin, his eyes cold as river stones. He stepped down slow, brushing the dust from his coat as though the land offended him. "Boone," he called, voice smooth as oil. "I reckon it's time we settled our account." Eli stepped forward, jaw tight, the sun burning hot on his neck. "You'll have your payment," he said. "The harvest's near done." Finch's gaze slid past him, landing on Clara where she stood by the porch. His grin widened. "A fine crop," he said, though his meaning ran deeper than wheat. "Seems you've found yourself a pretty bit of fortune out here." Clara felt the words crawl across her skin like thorns. Eli's hands clenched at his sides, but he held his ground. "You'll get what's owed," he said again, voice low. "Nothing more." Finch chuckled, tipped his hat, and climbed back into his wagon. "See that I do," he said. "Wouldn't want to come calling again." The wheels creaked over the dry earth, leaving a trail of unease behind. That evening the light fell long across the yard, painting everything in shades of copper and sorrow. Eli sat on the porch, shoulders bowed, the weight of failure pressing down like a stone. Clara joined him, setting a hand on his knee. "We'll find a way," she said softly. "The land's given more than we hoped. It will be enough." He looked at her, eyes rimmed red from exhaustion and pride. "You shouldn't have to pay for my mistakes." She met his gaze unwavering. "We're not paying for mistakes," she said. "We're paying for a life worth keeping." For days they worked without rest, gathering every grain, every stalk. Clara rode into town to sell bread, herbs, whatever she could craft with her hands. Eli hauled loads to the mill, trading long hours for coin. Piece by piece, they built the sum that might buy their freedom. But when the final day came, and the sun broke red across the sky, they stood before the trader's house with only part of what was owed. Finch counted it slow, his mouth twisting into a sneer. "Close," he said, "but not close enough." Eli's fists trembled. "You'll have the rest before the next moon." Finch shook his head. "A man's word is only worth the weight he can carry. Perhaps we'll make another arrangement." His eyes drifted again toward Clara. The implication hung heavy, thick as smoke. Eli stepped between them, voice sharp as a drawn blade. "You'll take the coin, or you'll take nothing." For a moment, silence stretched. Then Finch laughed, a sound without mirth. "You've got fire, Boone, but fire burns quick." He swept the coins into his pocket and turned away. "You've got 1 week." On the ride home, the sky darkened with storm clouds, thunder murmuring at the edges. Clara sat beside Eli, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "We'll not let him win," she said. "The land is ours. We'll fight for it." That night they spoke little. Rain began to fall, drumming soft on the roof, seeping into the cracks of their worry. Clara rose before dawn, her resolve hardened like steel. She gathered what she could, bundles of herbs, jars of preserves, the quilt she had sewn through long winter nights. "I'll go back to town," she said. "There are women who trade, men who'll barter honest." Eli wanted to protest, but he saw the strength in her eyes, the same strength that had carried them through silence and storm. He nodded once, the words thick in his throat. "Be careful." She rode out beneath a bruised sky, the wind biting at her cloak. The road stretched long and lonely, but she carried her purpose like a torch. In town, she traded with quiet dignity, refusing charity, earning respect from those who had once whispered behind her back. By dusk, her pouch was heavy with coin, enough to close the debt. When she returned, Eli was waiting by the gate, his face shadowed with worry. When she placed the pouch in his hand, he stared at it as though it were something sacred. "Clara," he murmured, "I don't deserve..." She silenced him with a touch, her palm against his cheek. "This isn't about deserving," she said. "It's about choosing." And in that moment, as the wind swept across the plains and the last light bled from the sky, Eli understood. She was no longer a purchase, no longer a bargain struck in desperation. She was the heart of this place, the soul of his redemption. The morning they rode back to town, the sky was washed clean from the night's rain, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth and promise. The wagon creaked beneath the weight of the grain sacks, and Clara's careful bundles, each one a testament to their labor, to their will. Eli held the reins, his jaw set, but his heart beat steady with something new, resolve not born of pride, but of faith. Beside him, Clara sat upright, her eyes fixed on the horizon, steady as a flame in the wind. They reached the trader's house as the sun climbed over the rooftops. Finch stood by the door, polishing his pocket watch, a smirk curling the edge of his mouth. "Boone," he drawled. "Didn't expect to see you so soon. Thought you might have run off into the hills." Eli climbed down without a word, lifting the pouch and setting it square on the porch rail. The coins inside clinked, bright and final. "We're square," he said. "Not a cent more." Finch opened the pouch, eyes narrowing as he counted. Then, with a reluctant grunt, he tied it shut. "Seems you've managed it." His gaze slid to Clara, lingering longer than decency allowed. "I'll admit, Boone, you've got yourself a wife worth more than her weight." Eli stepped forward, voice low but edged with steel. "You speak her name again, and I'll make sure it's the last thing you ever say." Finch's smirk faltered, replaced by a cold sneer. But something in Eli's stance, something carved by toil and loss and unyielding love, gave him pause. He tucked the pouch into his coat and stepped back. "Debt's cleared," he muttered, "but don't think the world'll spare you another." Eli turned, took Clara's hand, and together they walked away, the weight of debt falling from their shoulders like dust from an old trail. As they rode home, the land stretched open before them, the fields gleaming beneath a sky wide as forgiveness. For the first time, Eli felt the ground beneath him not as a burden, but as a promise, a place earned, not bought. In the weeks that followed, their days filled with a quiet peace. The harvest was stored, the barn mended, the hearth warm. Clara planted new seeds near the porch wildflowers, not for trade but for beauty. She said the earth deserved softness as much as strength. Eli built her a bench beside them, where she could sit in the evenings and watch the sun melt into the hills. Slowly, the house began to change. Curtains stitched by her hands hung in the windows. The air smelled of sage and fresh bread. Her laughter, once rare as rain, came often now, light and unguarded. And Eli, who had once lived like a shadow among ghosts, began to smile again, not from habit, but from joy. One night, beneath a sky spangled with stars, Eli brought out the Bible that had long gathered dust on the shelf. He opened it before her, the pages trembling beneath his calloused fingers. "I used to think this book was for men who hadn't sinned," he said, "but maybe it's for those of us who have, and still want to be better." Clara reached across the table, her hand resting atop his. "You already are," she whispered, "not because of the book or the land, because you choose kindness when the world offers none." He closed the Bible, eyes shining with quiet gratitude. "I paid $1 for a bride," he said softly, "but what I found was grace." Outside, the wind rustled through the wheat, whispering like an old hymn. The lamp flickered, casting golden halos across their faces. In that tender silence, something unspoken bloomed, an understanding deeper than vows, steadier than hope. Seasons turned. Winter came, fierce and unyielding, yet the house stood warm. They faced it together, their hearts steady as the fire in the hearth. And when spring returned, bringing green shoots through the thawed earth, Clara placed Eli's hand over her belly, her eyes shining with quiet joy. He stared at her, breath caught, a smile breaking slow and sure across his face. "A child?" he whispered, voice rough with wonder. She nodded, tears bright as morning dew. "A new beginning." Eli pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "Then this land," he said, "this home, it's not just ours anymore. It's a legacy." They stood there in the doorway, wrapped in the hush of dawn, the fields stretching endless before them. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and tilled earth, the promise of life renewed. Once, Eli had thought the world indifferent, the land unforgiving, love a thing too fragile to survive such loneliness. But now, with Clara's hand in his, the child stirring beneath her heart, and the horizon glowing gold with morning light, he understood. Redemption did not come like thunder. It came like sunrise, slow, steady, and certain.